in preparing for this conversation, I went online just to see, I mean, what do people describe as a research plan? And sure, in this case, it's being discussed in the context of proposal development. Um, but I thought it would be valuable also just to speak about it from the perspective of, yes, what happens once you've obtained your grant and you need to implement a project. So, in terms of the content, it can very much go into the research plan component of a proposal, but also it can be part of what others might call a research protocol or a plan that guides you in terms of the research. And Topista, please let me know if my presentation has a shadow.
No, it's fine. And just to note, they
It
can
does
also,
not, yeah.
yeah, they can also answer using the Q&A function. That is where they can post their questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of the content of this presentation, I'll go over what is a research plan, why is it valuable, what is in a research plan, and then how do we implement the research plan. So like I said, I decided to both look at content that would go into a research plan part of a proposal, but also once you get the funding, how do you implement your research in a systematic manner? Because ultimately, even implementing a project in a systematic manner where you're documenting things is part of financial sustainability, because it shows you can implement a project well and it then prepares you for further funding. So, what is the research plan? And so, there are different aspects if you go online that will tell you about a research plan, but essentially, it's really a blueprint or roadmap that details the project's aims, goals, methods, and logistics. And it helps ensure that research is organized and systematic. Or if it's in a proposal, you're really showing that you've thought through the process in a systematic manner. It helps keeps the research focused once you receive the money, and also ensures that the research team is on the same page with respect to the project's aims, but also how it's going to be implemented. So, what's in a research plan, whether for a proposal or as part of a research protocol for implementation of a project? It will describe the study methods in adequate details that others can easily pick up what you've written and replicate the work. It outlines the ethical considerations that will ensure responsible conduct of research. It includes a risk assessment that ensures that the research team is proactively thinking about potential challenges and how they would respond to those challenges. So the mitigation plans. And I think that was one of the aspects that was highlighted in the slides that Alpio presented. And then it describes the research team's expertise. Whoever is reading the research plan, or even if it's for the team itself, is really understanding that the team has the necessary human resources to implement the project and to do it well. And then it describes how the research processes will be managed. Importantly, it describes how the research findings will be shared and communicated. And for us who work at APHRC, where our vision is really that lives in Africa are transformed through research, we really need to think about how the research that we are undertaking gets into the hands of those who can actually use it, either to design policies or programs that will improve lives, in other words, transform them. And then also it ensures that resources needed are appropriately allocated and identified. And then it includes a timeline so that the research staff can stay on schedule. But if it's for a proposal, that you're really showing that you've thought through the timeline that it will take to implement the project within the project timeframe. So in terms of what is in a research plan, very much mirrors what might be in a research protocol that you're submitting for ethics approval. But also when you're developing a proposal, you'll probably speak to each of these aspects. The introduction and background, where you're setting the scene for this work. Why is this work important? Others have been in the field working on issues. What are you adding to that? A good friend of mine describes the introduction and background as that step where you're saying you've entered a room, there's a conversation going on, you listen to the conversation and then figure out where you can chip in to expand the conversation and improve the conversation. And then what are the study objectives? What are the methods that you'll use? Again, the ethical consideration, the team, the project management, the research communication, the budget, and the timeline. And so in the next slide, I just take a slide for each of these so that we go through the content. And again, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A and we can come to them. So in terms of the introduction, what one is hoping to do in this section, the introduction and background, is to summarize the significance of the proposed study. So really, why is it important to undertake this study? What does it add to the existing literature? So in this section, you're also as well summarizing the existing literature on the topic. And this is not perhaps what you do for a PhD thesis or a dissertation where it's an entire chapter. You're really trying to take that chapter into a few paragraphs where you're summarizing what are the key points in terms of the literature. It's also helpful depending, of course, on the leaning or the orientation of the study to describe the theoretical underpinnings. How do you see the concepts or issues that you're being connected? Is there a theoretical framework? Is there a conceptual framework? And again, just explaining how the study builds on and expands existing research. Some will talk about a research gap. But really, it's what are you contributing? In some cases, you could actually be replicating a study, and it's to expand perhaps the settings in which a study has been conducted. Then you also want to describe the research questions and study objectives. And I thought it might be useful, again, just to think about what is a good research question. I'll share the slides after this. And Monash University has a really good website where they discuss developing research questions, and it includes an interactive quiz as well that enables you they sort of share 3 iterations of a question and you pick which is the best framing of the research question. But essentially, a good research question is clear and focused. So it must be direct and specify the required task. Often I would say that when you read a research question, you can almost imagine what the methods might be like. And if you can't, then maybe ask whether the question is clear and focused. It has an appropriate scope. It's not too broad or too narrow. Because you want to show that really you have some depth to the scope of work that you're envisioning. So you want your research question not to be too broad that you can't answer it. What are the effects of climate change on the world? But you also don't want it to be too narrow. It should be complex, and it should avoid a simple yes or no answer. Or on the other hand, it shouldn't be overly difficult, that it would be difficult anyway to understand or to even conduct a study to answer it. And it has to be researchable and answerable using the available resources, including time. And then finally, it should be an analytical questions that allows for analysis of an issue and not a description. And again, I encourage you to go to the Monash University website through the link and just see how they frame research questions if you feel that you need more guidance in terms of that. Then there's the methods, which is perhaps the most extensive because there's a lot of information that's going. Sometimes, depending if you're working on a proposal, then you might need to be succinct, especially for the Wellcome Trust, for example, where you don't have a lot of leeway in terms of their number of words. But there are certain aspects you want to make sure that you're speaking to. What is the study design? Is it an RCT? Is it a qualitative study of a particular type? Describe the study settings. Where are you going to be conducting the study, and why is it useful to conduct the study in that particular setting? Describe the research methods that you'll use to meet your objective. And so this might be that it will include structured interviews that will be done one-on-one. Perhaps because it's a sensitive topic, you might be using other methods like self-interview and that sort of thing, participant observation, whatever method is relevant to the question that you're hoping to answer. And then describe the research participants. And sometimes you have a study where you will be interviewing multiple groups or engaging with multiple groups of researchers or rather participants. So for example, you might have interviews with adolescents, and you also want to interview caregivers, and you also want to interview other people like teachers who are in the community, health providers. And so it's important to describe each participant and how they will be involved in the study. And it's good as well to include the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so inclusion criteria is what attributes someone must meet to be a member of to be a participant in the study. So it might be that they have to be an adolescent mother who is aged 15 to 19 and who has a child, 1 to 3. Now, the exclusion criteria, because sometimes we see that there's a confusion where one assumes then the exclusion criteria is anyone that doesn't meet the inclusion criteria. That is, they are an adolescent father, they are aged 10 to 14, that sort of thing. But really, the exclusion criteria should be that person who meets all the inclusion criteria, but has something about them that will limit their participation in the study. So it could be that your study you can only conduct your study in English. And so someone might meet all the other criteria, but they also have to speak the language. And so it's whatever it is that the person they meet the inclusion criteria, but there are aspects that prevent them from participating, or you go and they are inebriated, or they have a disability that would otherwise limit their participation in the study. Then it's important as well to describe the sample size and the sampling process. If it's a quantitative study, you want to show that the sample size would be adequate for the sorts of analysis you plan to conduct. And then you want to describe the study tools and measures. For a proposal, maybe you might not need to include the actual study tools and measures, but if this is a research plan that you're using perhaps as a protocol, then you want to include your study tools in an appendix so that whoever is reviewing it can assess that as well. Then you want to describe the field procedures, including how participants will be recruited, the languages used, the methods of data collection. And then you want to explain how you will handle the data, how you will process it, and then how you'll analyze it. And then finally, it's important to describe any study limitations so that as people are reading your work, they also understand really what are the limits of the approach that you're taking. And that's true for either a proposal or what others might call a research protocol. To move on to ethical considerations, I think for much of the research we may conduct, I don't know the diversity of the people on the call, but assuming that you are conducting research with human participants, then it's important to look into the ethical considerations. How do you ensure that research is not harming your participants or that any risks are minimized? And one aspect of that is being able to describe the informed consent process, how you will ensure that all participants in your study provide informed consent. So they have to be able to understand what the study is about, understand its implications on them, the benefits, the risks, and then to be able to tell you, yes, go ahead. And it's also important to describe whether it will be signed or verbal. For verbal, this will often happen if the risk is really minimum, and perhaps the greatest risk is if someone got a hold of the consent form, and then perhaps there's some stigma or some other retribution that would result from that. In that case, you'll find some ethical approval committees might be willing to give allow for verbal consent. If you are conducting research with minors or other vulnerable groups, for example, those who are incarcerated, then it's important to describe also how you will involve, get consent both from the participant or assent if it's a minor, as well as consent from a caregiver or legally authorized representatives. And again, if it's a research protocol rather than proposal, a research plan for a proposal, then you want to include the informed consent forms in the appendix. And in our context, often the ethical review committee will want it in all the languages that the interviews or discussions will be held. It's valuable to describe how privacy will be ensured during data collection. Describe any compensation. So will you give people maybe the equivalent of $3, $5 for their time, or perhaps you'll give in kind. And then like in my case, we've worked with adolescents, and in that case, we are not able to give money, but often what we'll do is we'll provide a meal or refreshments. And so describing that sort of compensation. And then describe how the research team will be trained to ensure the ethical conduct of research. And this is true whether it's a research plan in a proposal or a research plan or protocol for an actual project. Just to make sure that everyone is aware that the team has undergone ethical training and is aware about ethics in research. And then describe how data will be handled to ensure anonymity and confidentiality, including how it will be stored or anonymized. And so, for example, if it's interviews with in-depth interviews where you're interviewing and recording, then you want to say what you're going to do. So the recordings will be destroyed immediately after transcription. And not only that, you'll go through the entire transcript. And if someone's name appears or some other aspect that would sort of limit the confidentiality, then all those are removed. And then describe any research risks and discomfort to participants and how these will be minimized. So, for example, if you're conducting a study on mental health, you might be asking people questions that cause a lot of discomfort and could actually trigger a negative experience. And so it's important to describe how those will be minimized and if you have taken any action to ensure that they get help as needed. And then provide details on ethical approvals or permissions to be obtained. So you will get it from a particular IRB, or you'll also need to get research clearance, which is the case for some in some of our countries, where you not only need the ethical approval, but you also need the clearance from a government-approved body. Then it's also important to think about your research team, describing the team's qualifications, their roles, any training, just so that anyone who is reading either the research plan in a proposal or your protocol can assess the personnel's suitability to undertake the research. And some of the critical aspects that you want to highlight are sort of their training and their qualification, any experience working in the study setting, experience with the study population. So-and-so has worked extensively with adolescents, such as the ones we propose to study. And then experience with the proposed research methods, brings strong expertise in randomized control trials, in qualitative research, that sort of thing. Just so that anyone who is reading can say, okay, this is a team that is well suited to undertake this research. And then it's useful to describe how you manage the project. And so this is true whether it's a research plan in a proposal or the research protocol. How will it be managed? Will you have regular meetings to assess progress and to troubleshoot? Or perhaps you'll communicate via email or any other approaches that you'll take to manage the project. And then outline field supervision processes. So in the field, there'll be a supervisor who will double check interviews, who will do, we used to call them shadow interviews. And this was often because once we made the transition to electronic data collection, it might be hard to go back because you don't have the questionnaire necessarily to say, okay, you were asked this question and this is how you responded and that sort of thing. So it's you have two people who attend the same interview and actually collect the same data, then you're able to compare and see where there may be challenges. Perhaps it's in how your team understands certain questions, and then you can troubleshoot at the very beginning. And then describe how project documents will be stored. Perhaps this might not be so critical in a proposal, but once you're getting into a project planning phase and describing your protocol, it's useful to think about how you will document how you'll maintain the project documents as part of data documentation, because you really need to show, okay, these were the questionnaires that were used, these were the perhaps this was the budget, this was X, Y, and Z, this is the publication plan, and to have that in a place where other people can get it, but also in a context like us where we're working in an organization, you want to think about others who may come after you might have been the one who was leading the project, then you leave the center, but someone should be able to come and pick up from where you are. So it's important to also think about how you store documents in a way that's accessible to others. I'll move over to the research communication plan. And in some cases, it's also called dissemination. In others, some funders prefer the use of research uptake, just so that it's clear that you're thinking beyond just your current study and how you'll collect the data, but also thinking about how that research will be used. And so in this case, it's really describing how you'll engage key actors during the research process to foster collaboration and to facilitate the use of the research findings. And just from our experience, my experience is the earlier you engage key actors during the research process, the better. If you're really keen to see that your research is being used in either for developing other research programs, for developing intervention programs, perhaps informing policy. The earlier you involve key actors, the more open they are when you actually share the findings. So if they're part of the design of the study, if they're involved in co-creation, if you inform them about the study and what you're hoping to get, then they can already see that, yes, you're considering their thoughts and perspectives even as you design the study. It's important to describe how the research findings will be shared with specific audiences. It might be that you will write peer-reviewed publications for a more scientific or technical audience. You'll also work on blogs, which are common now, newsletter articles, newspaper articles, and even for some, it's just that you'll have a PowerPoint presentation that you'll give perhaps to people in the community. And then also consider using a publication plan. For the projects that I've worked on, a number of them, I've found that it's really valuable, especially when you're working as a team, to think about the key papers that you want to write, and then other manuscripts or products that might come in. And so what I'm showing here is from one of our projects where we had a publication plan. And so really what it lists is, okay, these are the papers that we'll write. This is the person who will be the author. These are the people who will co-author. What sort of paper will it be? Will it be a peer-reviewed publication? When do we plan to submit it? And also now the status is really informing, okay, it's been submitted, it's been accepted, we're working on revisions. But this is also useful because one of, I think, a common challenge in the science field is sort of issues with around authorship and publications. And so if you think about the main papers and who the authors are, and you can even discuss the order and that sort of thing earlier on, before the manuscript is written, I think you can avoid many challenges that come around with authorship. And so for us, we really found this to be a useful tool where we sat down and thought about, okay, in this project period, we see ourselves only perhaps writing 4 because it's heavy on implementation. There are other manuscripts, so if people are interested, then they can include them in the plan. But these are the 4 main papers, and this is who will lead, and these are the people who will contribute. Then there's the budget, which really should outline the project costs in detail. And it's important to provide adequate budget notes to enable a third party to evaluate how responsible or feasible or reasonable the costs are. In my role, I'm asked to review a lot of budgets, perhaps as part of the proposal development process, or perhaps someone is going into the field and he has worked on a budget for the field work. And often, for me, the biggest struggle is when there are no budget notes to explain. So, for example, you might find that, there are conference costs, and then for one group of people, the conference cost is 20. In this one, it's 50. What is the difference? So always think about the person who will be looking at the budget without a lot of detail about the context. So the more you can explain so that it's clear that perhaps we will do the training for fieldwork in a cheaper hotel than the meetings where we will hold, say, meetings with stakeholders, then it's clear why even the unit costs are different. And then once you get the resources, while budgets are in their nature flexible because it's a budget, it's not an actual expenditure report, it's important to keep track and to inform the person who is funding the work of any significant shifts within budget lines. Many times in the grant agreement, it will tell you something like any variance beyond 10%. That you must get approval from the funder. So it's really important to keep track and to inform your funder of any significant shift, because what you don't want is someone to say, I'm not going to pay that because I didn't approve it. So especially if you're getting the money post-implementing. Then sometimes we are very frugal and perhaps we spend a lot less than we budgeted for. It can be a good thing that perhaps the exchange rate improved significantly and now you're able to buy more with an equivalent, say, amount of dollars or pounds. But spending too little is also a problem because it can suggest that you either overestimated the costs of your research or that you're poorly forecasting your expenditures, and some funders actually look down or have issues with that. And so even for us at the APHRC, we'll often have this conversation about burn rates and being told you really need to keep your burn rate high. In an organization setting where you're also getting indirect costs, which is a percentage of how much you spend, the better you are at spending, the more the organization is able to recover in terms of indirect costs. So spending too little can also be a problem. And then there's the timeline, which really should list all the project tasks and the estimated duration for each task. It's important to be realistic with the timeframes. Sometimes activities like ethical approval can take several months. So for us, for example, there's a particular ethical approval within a hospital where it can take 6 months. So it also helps you bear in mind whether, say, someone is telling you, please apply for this funding opportunity, but we only have 6 months. And then you see, I have to get ethical approval. It might take the 6 months. So you're saying that I think then we need to be flexible about the project period. So these are some of the things you want to take into account. Be as realistic as possible with the timeframes, and consider whether you're working on this full-time or part-time, because certain tasks might take longer if, say, you're only able to dedicate 20 hours a week versus if you're on a project 40 hours a week. And then for a project that's going to be implemented by a team, for each task, it is helpful to indicate who is responsible for each task. And it also makes sort of managing the project meetings easier, because you can say, okay, so-and-so, where are we with this? So-and-so, where are we with so-and-so task or this and this task? And so people are also aware of what they need to do and can follow up and track progress. So I did want to just end by showing a tool that is available for colleagues at the African Population and Health Research Center to help keep track of implementation and also as part of quality assurance. And Liz, I've seen your hand. I'll hand over just in a little bit. So this is what we call a quality assurance checklist, and it was actually developed under a project that was implemented by Population Council and APHRC, looking at, it was around unintended pregnancy and sexual and reproductive health. And this was a helpful tool for a project team to keep track of, have you undertaken all the steps that are needed? Are you documenting the things in the right place? So where you see EDMS, it means our electronic data management system. So a place where people can archive or store various documents related to projects. And it's really helpful for continuity. And if also you just want to refer to something, then you immediately know where to get to it. So really this checklist, it outlines the project, who the team is, the start date, the end date, and then it has different sections. And the next couple of slides, I'll just show you the different sections. But again, I'll be sharing the slides. And if you have further questions, or if you want a draft of the checklist, I'd be happy to share that as well. So in terms of the design, the protocol, the sampling methods, research question, you want to ask yourself, has a project inception meeting been held? Now, this is assuming you already have the funds and it's a protocol for your work. So have you had a project inception meeting? Who attended? Are there minutes? Then you can say yes, and then archive, say that the documents are stored in this particular folder. Have you taken a risk assessment, and have you outlined the appropriate mitigation measures? Have you developed a research uptake strategy, which can also be considered a research communication plan? Who do you plan to target? What products will you be developing? The frequency and that sort of thing. And again, for each of them, there is a reminder. Archive the document in whatever folder and provide a link here if it's an online folder, that sort of thing. Have you held a stakeholder workshop? Have you developed safeguarding protocols, the research protocol itself? Has it been reviewed? Which is important for quality assurance as well. Then has it been reviewed, in this case by our scientific review committee, but whoever is the responsible committee in your institution? Have you obtained the ethical approvals, and where are they stored? And what are the dates of approval? What are the numbers and that sort of thing? Then for the implementation, have you developed a manual for your field workers? Have they been trained? Have the tools been pre-tested, translated? Do you have a quality control protocol that's implemented, and any relevant documents? And then even as you implement the project, are you engaging with stakeholders to keep them abreast of where things are? Are you renewing any lapsed approvals and permits? In terms of analysis, are you making sure that every paper, say, for example, that is written is reviewed before being submitted? Because we need to think, again, it's a quality assurance checklist as well. So you want to make sure that you're taking all the quality assurance steps to ensure that even the products you develop meet the quality thresholds. Have you held consultations with stakeholders once you found the findings? Are they able to validate the findings? I think personally, I feel like this is an area where as researchers, perhaps we need to do more. We've begun to do more in some of our work with adolescents, for example, where before we finalize the report, we present the findings to young people and we ask them, what are your thoughts on these findings? Do they truly reflect your life? What sorts of recommendations? And I found that, at least in the projects that I've been involved in, has been very enriching, and it sort of ensures that the voices of those who we are working with are actually reflected even in terms of the recommendation. Then we also want to check that all data has been cleaned, anonymized, documented, and archived. Transcripts and field notes have been translated, anonymized, and archived, and where they're archived. And then for the administration is whether there was a grant agreement, the progress reports were submitted as planned, the closeout reports have been submitted as planned. And so really that's the checklist that's available for us in our research governance framework. Again, I'm happy to share it with colleagues who might find that such a checklist would be of value to you. And these are just some resources that I used as I was developing the proposal. And again, I'm happy to share the slides so that you can access each of these resources and also refer to the slides. But I want to end there. Thank everyone for listening and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you. So over to you, Alpio.